In this lesson, we're going to be talking about genetics, which is all the traits that you have and where you get them and how they're passed along. And they're named after this man, Mendel, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, as you know, traits are inherited from parent to child. We call this offspring. Children are offspring. And the question is, are the traits from each parent, as they're passing them on to their child, are they blended together? Or is there some other pattern to the inheritance? So is a blonde-haired mother and a dark-haired father create a brown-haired child, or is there some other pattern to it? This question, this scientific question, was answered by someone, a monk in the 17th century, and his name was Gregor Mendel. That's where the name Mendelian genetics comes from. So this is Gregor Mendel, and he lived between 1822 and 1884. And he did a lot of experimentation with the garden pea plant. This is a pea. Obviously, those are the seeds, and we eat them. And this is what the flower looked like. And all of his research he did with the garden pea, and he helped find out a lot about how inheritance from parent to offspring happens. Now, what Mendel discovered was by breeding these pea plants, he found that, first of all, he could breed what he called pure strains of the peas. And when he bred the pure strains of peas over and over again, there was no blending of traits. And he created what he called pure lines or pure strains. Instead, always the offspring had one particular trait. Then he crossed two of these traits. We call this the parental generation, the pea generation. He crossed, let's say he was breeding for flower color, and he combined a pure strain of purple flower with a pure strain of white flowered pea plants. When he did this, we call this the F1 generation, the first offspring generation or children generation. He found they were all purple. So somehow the white flowered trait disappeared. Then he would cross two of these F1 purple flowers, and when he did that in the next generation, the second generation of children, of offspring, he found the white trait reappeared, always in this ratio, 3 purples for every white. So this was an unusual inheritance pattern, and he documented that, and of course now we understand it a little better. So what he found was that some traits in offspring are dominant. Dominant doesn't mean stronger or better or even more common. Dominant means it shows. It always shows. We represent, when we do genetics, we use letters to represent these different traits, and the dominant trait we represent by a capital letter. It doesn't have to be an A, it can be another letter, but it's always a capital. And then the trait that disappeared, in this case it was the white flower trait that disappeared and then reappeared, we call this the recessive trait. This doesn't mean that it's weaker or it's less common even. It just means it sometimes disappears. This we represent by the same letter. Again, it doesn't have to be an A, but it has to be the same letter as the dominant, and it's going to be a lowercase letter. Now remember, traits are inherited by the passing on of genes on structures called chromosomes, which you're familiar with. For every trait, there are always 2 copies of the gene, 2 separate chromosomes, one that came from your mother and one that came from your father, or one that's passed down from mother and one that's passed down from father. These 2 copies of a gene or chromosomes are called alleles. The allele that always shows we call the dominant allele, and the one that sometimes hides or disappears is called the recessive allele. Now, because you have 2 chromosomes, for every gene you have 2 copies, 2 alleles, we call this your genotype. It's your distribution of genes, your distribution of chromosomes. If you have 2 dominant alleles, both of them are the same, we call this homozygous dominant. And we represent that with 2 capital letters. In this case, we used A. It doesn't have to be A. If you have 2 recessive alleles, we call this homozygous recessive. And again, you don't have to use A, but in this case, it's 2 lowercase letters to represent that. But then there's another case that we have. The other possibility, you could have 1 dominant and 1 recessive, and this we call heterozygous, and it's represented with a capital and a lowercase letter. Now, whatever the genotype is that you have will determine the phenotype or the trait that the plant will have in this case. If the plant is homozygous dominant, we will have a purple flower. If it is homozygous recessive, it will have a white flower. But here's the tricky part, and this is why we see the inheritance pattern we did with Mendel's peas. If the genotype is heterozygous, we see a purple flower because you see the dominant trait will show and the recessive trait in this case will disappear. So if an individual is homozygous dominant or heterozygous, it will show the dominant trait. We call this the phenotype, as I mentioned a minute ago. But if an individual is homozygous recessive, that's the only time that you actually see the recessive trait. And again, we call this the phenotype. So we'll see the recessive trait only in the homozygous recessive genotype. So if we look back at Mendel's cross with his peas, here in the first generation of offspring, we see a heterozygous individual. So when we cross these two, in only one instance, you're actually going to see the recessive trait, the white flower, because this individual, its genotype is homozygous recessive. The other three possibilities are all going to show just the dominant trait, which is the purple flower. So knowing this, we can predict the outcome of genetic crosses. We can predict if we know the genotype. And this is all based on probability. It's mathematics. Each parent, of course, donating one of two different alleles that they may have, and then each offspring receiving one allele from the mother and one allele from the father. Knowing this information, we can make predictions. So if we look at the first parent, let's say the parent is homozygous dominant, and the other parent is homozygous recessive. Each of these parents can donate one of two alleles. This one can donate this one or this one. This parent can donate a dominant or a dominant in this case. When we combine one from each parent, the possibilities are here. In this case, each possibility is heterozygous because no matter how you combine from parent 1 and parent 2, in this particular example, you're going to get heterozygous, and all of them will have, in this case, red flowers. Now, we study these predictions with something called a Punnett Square. You may have seen something similar to this in algebra class, but this is a table of probabilities. It's used to make predictions from known genetic crosses. So if we visit back again with Mendel's pea flowers, we're crossing the first offspring generation, which were both heterozygous. If we do this cross, we see that combining this P and this P, two capitals, we get a purple flower with the genotype homozygous dominant. We combine this one, and we get another purple flower, this time heterozygous genotype. Again, this allele with this allele, and we get heterozygous and a purple flower. And then here is the case where you see the recessive trait reappearing after it's disappeared. We have a recessive allele and a recessive allele. So 1 in 4, 3 of 4 will be purple, showing the dominant trait, and 1 in 4 will be white, showing the recessive trait. So that's the probabilities based on what we know about the parents. Now this is just the beginning, and we'll study this more in class.